what are the atoms, what is the basic structural blocks of a society and of a country. And if you begin to think about what it is, it's actually communities built by families and homes. So I always tell people the most important thing that happens in our country is not what happens in the White House, it's what happens in your house.
Greg Laurie here in our nation's capital, Washington, D.C., and I'm in the State Department. And this is a very important building with a staff that serves our nation. And it is directed by our Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. And so I met Secretary Rubio over 10 years ago when he was then Senator Rubio. And he came to a couples conference I was speaking at. And someone said, would you like to meet Marco Rubio? They didn't say Senator Marco Rubio. I thought, wow, someone with the same name is a well-known senator. Well, it turned out to be one and the same, and we got to know Marco and his wife, Jeanette. Their invitation went to Washington, D.C., and met a lot of his very interesting friends like Trey Gowdy and Tim Scott and so many others who had strong faith. What I really loved was how they would study the Bible together, and their faith motivated and moved them in so many of their decisions. So I had the unique honor to just sit down with Secretary of State Marco Rubio and talk about his role, his pivotal role that he is playing in our nation right now, starting with the release of the hostages and the great confidence that the president has placed in him. In fact, President Trump just said of Secretary of State Marco Rubio, he is the greatest Secretary of State in American history. That's quite a compliment, and I believe well-deserved. So you're going to see perhaps a side of the Secretary you have not seen before. We're going to talk about all kinds of things, about his life, about his faith, about how his faith influences what he does, and much more. So join me now for this special sit-down talk with Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Well, Mr. Secretary, thanks for taking the time to talk a little bit, and congratulations on this incredible, historic achievement of finally getting the hostages freed. Yeah. And I was watching on television when the president at the Knesset, and you were there with him in Israel, said of you that you're the greatest Secretary of State in history. What went through your mind when you made
Well, look, the president's great about that stuff, and I'm grateful to him, but really the credit for that deal and so many other things belongs with him. I mean, he did things, and I've said this, I've sort of alluded to it. Maybe one day the story will be told. One day history will provide the details of how this came about and how this was possible, but I assure you the president did some extraordinary things that he had to do to make this happen. And then we had a great team on the ground over there. I mean, Steve Woodcoff and Jared Kushner deserve a tremendous amount of credit for sort of carrying out and executing on the president's plan with regards to this. And obviously I'm blessed and grateful to be a part of it. And you know, over time, and perhaps you've had the chance to do this too, we've met a lot of those families. A lot of those families that we saw the videos are people we've met with 4, 5, 6 times. And in the depths of this, there were months where frankly I doubted whether they were ever going to see their loved ones again. I mean, there was a real question about whether it was going to happen. So to be able to watch video of these people that I've met with, some of them as recently as 6 days before they were here in Washington on the 7th of October, to be able to see those people on television reuniting with their loved ones just 6 days later was is one of those things that I think you can serve in a place like this for a very long time, and few people get a chance to be a part of a day as historic as that. Now that said, there's a lot of work to be done to sustain this, but the one thing that's irreversible is that those hostages are back with their families.
We were in Israel not long ago, and we raised money to buy a bulletproof ambulance to give to the state of Israel, because that says it all. They need a bulletproof ambulance, effectively a tank that brings medical care for people. And I met one of the mothers of the hostages, and the anguish in her face. And I pray and trust that her son was one of the ones that finally did get released. We met over 10 years ago, and we were at a couples conference.
Yeah, in Hawaii.
And someone came up to me and said,
Marco Rubio is here and wants to meet you. I said, wait, you mean Senator Marco Rubio? Well, I'd love to meet him. And then we met you and your wonderful wife, Jeanette. We got to know each other. And what so impressed me was that you were taking, and actually it's a long flight from Florida
Yeah.
to Hawaii.
Yeah.
But
And we went twice, 2 years in a row,
you
if you
did.
recall. Yeah.
That's true. And it was so great just to see you there, because that says a lot about you, that your marriage matters to you.
Yeah.
That you would take that time to be with your wife and to strengthen your own marriage. And your wife and my wife are having tea right now. And Kathy, my wife, texts with Jeanette, your wife, all the time. And she told us something really amazing about you. And that, you're always going to get inside intel from the wives, right? But that when you got up at Charlie Kirk's memorial service, you gave what I thought was a stunning talk.
One of the things he wants us to take away from this, from all of this, is the following. His deep belief that we were all created, every single one of us, before the beginning of time, by the hands of the God of the universe, an all-powerful God, who loved us and created us for the purpose of living with him in eternity. But then sin entered the world and separated us from our Creator. And so God took on the form of a man and came down and lived among us. And he suffered like men. And he died like a man. But on the third day, he rose unlike any mortal man. And to prove any doubters wrong, he ate with his disciples so they could see, and they touched his wounds. He didn't rise as a ghost or as a spirit, but as flesh. And then he rose to the heaven, but he promised he would return, and he will. And when he returns, because he took on that death, because he carried that cross, we were freed from the sin that separated us from him. And when he returns, there will be a new heaven and a new earth, and we will all be together, and we are going to have a great reunion there again with Charlie and all the people we love. Thank you, and God bless you.
In fact, I thought you did a better job presenting the gospel than some preachers I've heard. It was theologically accurate, it was passionate, and it was also understandable. And we were so impressed. Like, that was such a great moment. And then Jeanette told Kathy that you had no notes when you got up and did that.
Yeah, it works out better that way sometimes. 'Cause I think so what happens when you don't write things out is you might forget to say something.
Yeah.
But I think what you lose sometimes is sort of the authenticity of it.
Yeah.
There are speeches you have to give that are written.
Yeah.
And often I'll do an outline or just notes of reminders. But I think these things always come best from the heart. I want to go back to something you mentioned about marriage, because I know it's a topic. It's interesting, the other day I heard someone say this, and it's absolutely true. If you look at the Bible repeatedly in the Gospels, and even in the Old Testament, when it describes God's love for his people, it's always discussed in marital terms. It's never described as a parent's love for a child. It's almost described as the bridegroom. And so it tells you the importance that marriage has to God. How in many cases, marriage is in fact a sacramental union that really reflects God's love for people. So that said, it's as everyone knows who's been married in life, it's a vocation, it's a job, but it is the most important job I'll ever have. It's more important than being a parent. It's actually related to it, but it's even more. The best gift that parents can give their children is sort of the teamwork of a man and a woman working together to raise a child. And back to the point you made on the speech and so forth, I think one of the things that were unique about Charlie is he really, people consider him to be a political voice, and he was involved in American politics, but his mission, I felt, his ministry really in many cases, was much deeper than just politics. It was a call to the reinvigoration of a society of all the things we know that work, of all the things we know are good.
Right.
And not to force it upon anybody, but I thought in many ways that's what his mission was really geared towards. And it had political aspects to it. But I thought the work he did went far beyond just simple politics from a partisan perspective or anything like that. So I felt that was an important opportunity to talk about that as well, because I did get to know Charlie quite well. And in fact, I'd just been exchanging text message with him 5 days before he died. He had just recently, he was either in South Korea or returning from South Korea, and is very concerned about some of the things that are happening to churches inside of South Korea right now. And so we were going to talk about that the next time we got together, and unfortunately that conversation won't happen. But yeah, that memorial, by the way, was an amazing
It was.
Situation there with a number of.
100 million people watched it.
It was unreal. Yeah.
So, coming back to marriage, I mean, you could almost take every social ill in America today and directly relate it to the breakdown of the family, and specifically to a lack of fathers. I've looked at statistics of people who are incarcerated, people who turn to drugs, girls who get pregnant outside of wedlock, the list goes on. And in almost every instance, they come from a broken home, and specifically, they had no father growing up. I've heard it said that a nation can survive, a family can survive without a nation, but a nation cannot survive without the family.
Yeah. Well, I think the important point to note is that it is a nation, but what are the atoms? What is the basic structural blocks of a society and of a country? And if you begin to think about what it is, it's actually communities built by families and homes. So I always tell people the most important thing that happens in our country is not what happens in the White House, it's what happens in your house.
Yeah, good.
So that's an example of it too. And so if you think about what composes a nation and a society, it basically is community, which is composed of families, which is obviously composed of homes. And it is, the family in an ideal setting is the first government, it's the first school, it's the first church. It is the foundational to everything. Now, does that mean that someone who comes from a broken home or someone who comes from a dysfunctional family can't be successful? Of course it doesn't mean that. Does that mean that there are some very courageous single parents, particularly single women that are out there, single mothers that are raising their children? It's extraordinary, and I think it calls an obligation to be helpful to them and understand that the mission they have is so difficult. In many cases, they'll be the ones that tell you how hard it is. So some amazing stories out there, and some heroic women in particular. And I say women, there are obviously men that have done this, but you run into a lot of women that have had to raise children on their own, and it's a tough deal. But we know this, the ideal setting, the one that history, thousands of years of collective human history teaches us, and even in our own country, the most effective way to raise children is in a home in which a loving mother and father are doing it together, although in some circumstances, unfortunately, that's not possible for a variety of reasons.
Well, my mom was married and divorced 7 times. I never had a father growing up. But when I became a Christian, I found father figures. I found mentors, older men who were godly, who could fill that role in my life. And speaking about extended family, your grandfather played a major role in influencing you to kind of follow a political course, didn't he?
Well, and I guess in the sense is he inspired, I think we're all born with natural interests and inclinations. So obviously I had some natural interest in government history, things of this nature.
At a very early age.
What I had was the blessing of a grandfather, my mother's father, who lived with us for much of my life until he passed away. I was about 13, who spent a lot of time sort of feeding that spark. And so I think in life, if you can find, there are a lot of things that people love to do, but they're not good at it, and that's called a hobby. And then there are things that we are good at, but we don't like, and that's always going to feel like work. And then there are things you love and you're good at, and that's where you found your calling. And that depends on who you are, what that is. And sometimes it's something that makes a lot of money, and sometimes it's something that makes a great impact, and sometimes it's just your mission, your calling in life, because that's how God made you. And I think in this particular case, I had a natural interest, and then I had from a young age someone that helped feed it. Now, I don't want to mislead people. When I was 16 and 17 and 18 years of age, government and politics was not the leading feature of my life in terms of what I was thinking about or interested in. But I always followed it, especially if it was topical, like during an election in 1988 or what have you. And my grandfather helped fuel and feed that, because he was someone that loved to read. He had read a lot. He had been disabled as a young child by polio. He was one of multiple children, over a dozen children that lived in a family in rural Cuba, a farming family. So he's the only one that couldn't work labor, couldn't provide labor. So he was actually the one that went to school, learned how to read, and ultimately became what's called a lector, someone who would sit in the front of the cigar rolling factories in Cuba, and while the workers rolled cigars, they'd hire someone to sit in the front and read to the workers. First they'd read the newspapers, then they'd read a novel. So he was very well read because of that, and sort of fed that. And it, by the way, I think is a testament to the impact grandparents can have on the lives of young people as well. They're also a treasure.
Yeah, very much so. And so when I first met you, you were a senator. Now you're the Secretary of State. And I can't even imagine the kind of information you're exposed to, and the things that could cause great alarm, and the things that could cause fear. And I don't know if you deal with things that keep you up at night, but how do you process that? And maybe are there passages of Scripture you turn to help put yourself in a place of trusting in God, or how you cope with all of that?
Well, I think, first of all, Erica Kirk yesterday had some pretty powerful lines at the memorial service where she talked about how Charlie lived free of fear. Yes. I think fear is an enemy. It's a paralytic. Yeah. It almost, so I think fear is the wrong terminology. Certainly we all worry. We all have things to worry about. Here's what I would say for Christianity in particular. Of all the faiths in the world, and I'm not prejudging or criticizing anybody, but of all the faiths in the world, right, the ones who should never live in fear, or the ones who should never live in worry that becomes paralyzing, are Christians, because we know how it ends. Yeah. I always say this to people all the time, and it reminds me a little bit of, like, you watch a scary movie, you've seen it 10 times, you know how it ends, you know the lead character survives, but nonetheless you still get nervous every time you see it, even though you know what the outcome of it's going to be. And I think that's our story, right? The story that we know that at the end of time there'll be a new heaven and a new earth, and that Jesus will return. We also know that between now and then there'll come a period of great tribulation, of great challenges. The world's never been free of them, but this will be specifically extra. And so we already know that. And so for us to somehow, I think for some to somehow aspire to live in a world free of problems and free of challenges and free of worry is not realistic. It's also not biblical. It's not true to our faith. And so, but in the end, I always sort of remind people of the Christian faith, like, of all the people in the world that shouldn't be that anxious about the future, it should be us, especially when it comes to global events, because we know how the movie ends, we know how the story ends. We don't know when it ends. We can't detail exactly how that's going to play out, but we know generally the thematic of it, and the thematic of it is victory and the restoration of what we should have been from the very beginning. And that's the most important thing to tell everybody. We were not, death is not a natural, it's natural because it entered into the world through sin. But we were never meant to die. We were not created to die. And all of that entered the world because of death, and now we're in a process of sort of overcoming that. Jesus did that, and now we're in the process as mortals as a result of the consequence of sin, of living through that. But we know how the story ends, so we should be, so it helps manage. That's a key way that I think faith.
I think if the Secretary of State thing doesn't work out, you can consider being a pastor.
Well, but it's much harder than being Secretary of State, I think.
I don't think so. But, listening to you talk about these things, it is surprising and very encouraging for a man in your position to believe. And you mentioned this at Charlie's memorial service. You not only talk about the death of Christ, his resurrection, you talked about the return of Christ, and you just talked about it again. And, the Bible, there's what we call prophetic events, signs of the times that tell us Jesus Christ is coming back again. You're more privy to information than probably anyone out there, apart from the president, of course, and members of his cabinet. But do you see things happening in our world right now that make you say, wow, I believe that Christ could be coming back very soon?
Well, I'm sure I do. I mean, in the sense that, but I also believe that if you look at the 2,000 years of Christianity, every generation has believed they lived in the end times. They couldn't imagine things getting any worse than they were. I imagine if you lived in the 1940s and saw the growth of Nazi Germany and the particularly early on the progress that they had made and the successes they were having in the battlefield, that was a very scary time. So I think it's almost a trap. We're basically told that whether it's death or the second coming, it'll come as a thief in the night. I mean, people will be out there basically doing normal life activities. So rather than try to predict it or anticipate it, I think you just sort of understand that's how the story ends. And in the meantime, this is what we're called to do, to live our faith.
100% I agree with that. I've said that I'm going to get to heaven. It may be through a taxi or an Uber. I'm going to get there. So it doesn't matter. You have that hope that you're going to be with Christ. But we just went to the Holocaust Museum. And I've been to Yad Vashem in Israel, as I'm sure you have been as well. But it's just so stunning to see something like that happen in relatively modern times. And yet we see the rise of anti-Semitism around the world today, especially among young people and especially on college campuses, even Ivy League universities. Why a return of anti-Semitism?
Well, there's a lot of factors to deconstruct there. I'm not sure I'm an expert at explaining all of it. I can tell you that it is an ancient poison. It is it's one of the oldest hatreds in the world. And it's caused tremendous harm repeatedly throughout history. It's also been the story of the Jewish people, of the challenges that we know they've faced from the very beginning, despite God's covenant, and certainly, even 70 AD, the destruction of the temple and the scattering of the people. And so, but in more modern times, obviously, the Holocaust brings to mind sort of the worst of it, sort of in an era that we can see.
October 7th
And then October 7th, which is it was the deadliest day for Jewish people since the Holocaust. So I think it puts us on guard very much to understand that. I think hatred, unfortunately, is part of the fallen human condition. But somehow anti-Semitism is a unique, enduring form of hatred that has repeated itself in every generation. Some more pronounced than others, but certainly the Holocaust being the worst, and then October 7th being right there next to it in terms of what happened in a single day. And I think it puts us on guard and realizing it. I think some of what's happened in modern times, unfortunately, is you've seen in sort of contemporary times, has been this sort of melding of this they call themselves anti-colonial, anti-capitalist, anti-Western sentiment that latches on to key issues, and they latched onto the situation in Gaza as the latest example. They view Israel, and by extension the Jewish people, as they say it openly, as some sort of colonial, capitalist invaders that occupied a land that didn't belong to them, and in many cases making ahistoric arguments about how the Jewish people had never had an enduring presence in that land, which we know is not true. So I think it's latched onto it, and it's a globalized movement. And I think it's sick and destructive and should be rejected in all its forms.
Very much, very true. And then the interest among so many young people in socialism and communism. I mean, your family, of course, came from Cuba, a communist country. Why this interest in communism? Do you think that so many of these young people even fully understand what any of these things mean, when they call people fascists, Nazis, and they are drawn to communism and socialism? What is going on here?
Well, it's part of what, actually talking about Charlie Kirk, it's part of the things that he was confronting on campuses, and I thought he did it in a very effective way, which is that he would engage people in debate and force them to justify the argument. Understand that in many of these cases, these beliefs that some people adopt about socialism, about communism in particular, are never challenged. They're not challenged at the university setting. It begins with your professor sort of pushing this on you, and then there really aren't forums available in which that can be challenged. So I do think it's a combination. I think academia has played a big part in this. Academia has become a magnet, and there's always been, to be clear, there's always been crazy professors. There's always been people that are out of whack in how they think about certain things. I don't think it had been as institutionalized as it's been over the last 30 or 40 years. And you've now produced multiple generations of young Americans that have gone through this system, particularly pronounced in our most elite schools. People leave these most elite schools with that level of indoctrination, and in 20 years they wind up in positions of authority and power. And so I think we're now beginning to see the ramifications of that. In many cases they go back and become the crazy professors, except there's a lot more of them. Sometimes they go back and become administrators. And so that needs to be challenged, because the purpose of a university is to learn, and you learn by being exposed and being challenged in your beliefs, not by indoctrination. There's a big difference between education and indoctrination. So I think there's some consequence of that we're seeing play out. And I want to say it's not just a U.S. phenomenon, it's a Western phenomenon that's played out in multiple places around the world. But I also see there's a legitimate pushback happening now. And I think that's what Charlie Kirk, as much as anything else, did, is he challenged young people to question these things they were being taught. And in many cases, engaged in debate in front of them with people he disagreed with, as the most effective way of poking holes in the argument of the other side.
Yeah. You're very upfront about your faith. When you were senator, at one point you were texting a passage of scripture every day.
Yeah, on the old Twitter, now known as X.
Yes, that's right. And you would do it, I think, very early in the morning, right? Like, what time do you wake up in the morning?
Depends on the day. Depends on the time zone. If we're traveling, we're now at this time. I'm generally an earlier riser than other people.
How do you adjust to all these time zones? Keep your wits about you.
It depends on where you're going. You generally try to, it depends how long you're going to be there. So we just did a very quick trip to Israel, Egypt, and back. So you didn't want to mess with the time because you were going to be back the next day.
You stayed in American time.
You kind of just did it, and you got, the president doesn't really much sleep. I was on his plane. He doesn't really sleep.
Is there a place for you to sleep on that plane?
Except but not comfortably. And I'm not a great sleeper to begin with. Like there are people I can sit in a chair and just fall asleep for 15 minutes and they wake up. That's not my forte. But if it's a one-day thing, you can handle it. I think if it extends. Now, if you're going somewhere around the world where there's a 12-hour time difference, I try to at least cut that in half and maybe a day or two ahead of time, fall asleep if possible, 6 hours earlier, so your body but you don't. You just got to fight through it. And usually the first day is not as bad. It's the second or third day where it starts to hit you a little bit. So, But you work through it. It hasn't been too bad.
Years ago, I flew to Australia, which, as you know, is like a 15-hour flight from LA. And I got off the plane and I had a speaking engagement. And I drank 3 espressos right before I spoke. And as I got up to speak, I felt like I was in an altered state of consciousness. What I was saying made no sense to me. And I just said to myself, your mind was right when you wrote the notes. Read the notes and don't ad lib. It was so bad, but
it is. It takes a little bit of adjusting to do, and I think some people are more affected by it than others. Like I said, I'm fortunate. I've never really had like bad jet lag. Yeah. I mean, there's been times where it's 2 in the afternoon somewhere, but it's 2 in the morning, and so your body's telling you need to be sleeping right now. But we fight through it, and that's why God invented caffeine.
Yes. Yeah. Now You've made sacrifices for your faith. I mean, you stood up for your faith. Has it ever cost you politically, do you think, or has it not affected you?
I don't know if it has or hasn't, to be honest with you. I can't give you an example of where I thought.
It's helped you because I think with you, it's so beautifully integrated into your life and everything that you say and do.
Well, but the gospel's clear. You'll be hated for it.
Yes, that's true.
So I think people that understand, people that go into this understanding that ours is the faith of the cross. It's not the faith of winning the lottery, and there's nothing wrong with wealth. There's nothing wrong with success. There's nothing wrong with happiness. Right. But I think it's a misunderstanding of Christianity to believe that that it leads to like happiness and prosperity. These are things that God may bless you with, but our faith is the faith of the cross. And in fact, if you look at the era of Christianity, where Christianity has been strongest and most vibrant, is when it's countercultural.
That's true.
When it's been strong and most vibrant is when it's been oppressed. Now, I don't seek oppression. We don't seek to be hated, but it's going to happen. And once you understand that, and in some cases, it's not just hatred, it's a special kind of anger that you see that some people adopt as a result of your faith. But I can't say it's necessarily led to a sacrifice or it's hurt me or harm me politically, but it really wouldn't matter. I mean, there might be some issues that I believe strongly about when I was in political office. Now I'm in, an executive office, but but I'd rather lose an election than be wrong on those issues in the public stage.
You once said that there's never been a nation like the United States. It begins with the principles of our founding documents, principles that recognize our rights come from God, not government. And you see America as unique. I mean, I would say, and I'm sure you would agree, but I believe America is the greatest nation in the world today. We have our flaws, we have our shortcomings, but there's no place like America. Do you agree with that? And if so, why?
Well, first of all, America is not a government. I think that's the mistake people make, is they think America is a government. We have a government, but America is a nation. And a nation, as I said earlier, is a society made up of communities. This is really where change matters, where change happens, and communities are made up of families. Yes. And so that's the key. And if that breaks down at the family level, and you can't have community, and if community breaks down, then you really aren't a nation per se. So to me, that's always been fundamental and important. We're not a government. We have a government, but we're not a government. The American story is special and unique because it is founded on a very powerful principle, which even today is not largely accepted in much of the world, but certainly when those words were written, were alien to most people. The idea, for almost everyone that's ever existed, they were told that you don't have any rights. To the extent you have them, it's because they've been given to you by your leaders. Your rights are whatever your leaders say you have. And largely your rights are whatever belong to the people with the most weapons who can win the war. And the notion that somehow, no, your rights don't come from the law, they don't come from the government, they don't come from your leaders, your rights come from your creator. And the job of government is to protect your rights, not to decide them or to bestow them. That's a very unique thought, and that's a very unique belief, and it's a foundational principle of the country. Have we always lived up to that belief? No, because it's a human institution, right? At the end of the day, anything that's a human institution will bring with it the flaws of humanity. But I also think one of the great things about the American story is that every injustice, every great cause in American history has been a demand to fulfill our founding principles, not a revolution against our founding principles. The reason why slavery could not survive in America is because it violated our founding principles. The reason why women vote is because it violated our founding principles. Every single one of the great causes in American history has been a demand that we live up to the principles of our founding.
Beautiful. Okay, so closing lightning round. Weird questions you've probably never been asked, but your friend Greg is going to ask you.
All right.
Okay, so what's your favorite food? Like when you go-to comfort food, what do you order?
Chicken Parmesan or a pizza of good pizza.
Really?
And I just like that stuff.
I love pizza too.
Yeah.
Like, do you have a favorite movie of all time, or maybe a top 3 or 4 movie?
Well, you know, I like all the. I don't know about Godfather 3 was okay. I mean, if they had only made a Godfather 3, people wouldn't say, nice, good.
Yeah.
But I think Godfather 2 followed by Godfather 1. I get it; it's not the most family-friendly thing, but it's such a fascinating
Well,
story.
it's a story of a family.
It is a story of a family. It is. You know,
It's one of my favorites too.
It's very well done.
Not 3, but 1 and 2. Yes, is on my list. So, what is your favorite book? I know you read the Bible all the time, so we'll exclude that. So, is there a book that's profoundly moved you, or you go back to and read again and again?
You know, there's a couple books out there that I think are very fascinating. The Obstacle is the Way by, I think it's Ryan Holiday, if I'm not mistaken, and it tells the story about how many of the great achievements in human history were people that had failed 1,000 times before they finally got it right. So that was one, and then autobiographies. I've read multiple autobiographies about Lincoln, about Churchill. Yeah. I think you learn a lot about not autobiographies, biographies, from Lincoln, about Churchill, about other. I actually read one, and I don't remember exactly who the author was. It was about Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, who I think, in hindsight, is probably an underestimated president. Yes. He wasn't probably the flashiest and most remembered, but I think was a very foundational figure. I mean, the interstate highway system in the United States is an example, and things of this nature. But nowadays, I wish I could read more, but everything I read are like memos and decision points and letters and things of this nature. I got to get back to that. You know, again, going back to Charlie Kirk, because we just came from that, he was a very big reader. Yes. He consumed about 100 books or more a year, mostly in audio version because it was hard to. And I do think people should read more, and I encourage them to do so. I for a time, I read so much I lost my eyesight, as I was telling you before we went on the air. Well, I don't know. I blame reading for eroding my reading vision. So.
Like, when you look back at the presidents in American history, I know you love and appreciate President Trump, so we'll exclude him. Who are some of your favorite U.S. presidents?
You know, we've been blessed as a country. I made this observation the other day. I think God has bestowed upon us in different times in our history the right person for the right time. Yeah. And so I think you can go back and find multiple examples of that. I think President Trump is the right person for this time. He is achieving things and is doing things as president that you wouldn't get in an orthodox type presidency. And I think it's, you know, to be honest with you, I think that he is and he was very effective in his first term when I was in the Senate. Yeah. And I'm not saying it just because I'm part of the administration, but this administration, this second Trump term, I think he's going to achieve things because he challenges what people think is possible. What people tell him is impossible, he doesn't accept that. Yeah. And he works through it in a way that...
It's almost like a red cape in front of a bull with...
Absolutely. I look back at Reagan, right? And he was the right person for the right time. When Ronald Reagan took office in 1980, the notion that the Soviet Union would collapse and disappear, people thought that's just not possible. I mean, we have to figure out how to coexist and accept it because Soviet Union's not going anywhere. And about a year after he'd been out of office, the Soviet Union, 2 years after he'd been out of office, the Soviet Union was gone. Yeah. And so I think you go all the way back to Lincoln as an example. We've raised him earlier. Yeah. And he had a combination of his temperament and life experience positioned him to lead us through Civil War in a way that perhaps some other leader would not have been able to do so in that period of time. And even in our founding with George Washington.
Those are all the ones that I chose. Wow. Washington, Lincoln, Reagan, Trump, and I also really like Teddy Roosevelt too, you know.
Yeah, I don't know as much about Teddy Roosevelt as I wish. I mean, I know about him, but I don't have the. But even with Washington was so unique because, you know, a brand new country. You put the wrong person as your first president, and you could wind up with somebody who's there for 20 years and appoints himself king. In fact, there are people that wanted him to be named the king, and he was not only did he serve, but he did so reluctantly. He didn't do it enthusiastically, but he didn't want to be president. He didn't fight that war because he wanted to be the leader of a country. So from our very inception, from the very beginning, I thought we've been very blessed in that regard. Yeah. And there are others, you know, I know not of my party, but I think, and perhaps some of the things he did on our economy were not things I would have agreed with, but I think FDR deserves credit for having guided our country through a very delicate time leading into World War II, where there are a lot of people up until the eve of Pearl Harbor. He knew what was coming. He knew the gathering storm, and he had to prepare our country for war while balancing the fact that a large majority of Americans had no interest in another European war.
Wow. How would you like to be remembered? Like, what would you like to be known for? You mentioned the importance of your family, of course, the important positions you've held, but what things would sum up your life? I'd like people to remember.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't... at 54, I still don't think too much about that yet. I think ultimately there's two ways. How I'd like to be remembered professionally is someone who made a difference and had an impact. Yeah. And obviously had the opportunity to do that in the United States Senate representing Florida, and now this new opportunity under President Trump, that I was, effective at the job that I was given, and that we made an impact, that we made a difference. There's really only one reason to do this, and that is to be able to make a difference and have an impact. I think as a person, I'd like to be remembered as someone, who was a good husband and a good father, and who tried the best he could and perfectly to live out the teachings and tenets of his faith and to model that behavior as much as anything else. And that's an ongoing project. That's the one thing about life is you can blow it all in one moment. It's a daily reminder of how difficult it is to walk on that path. But when it's all said and done, I think we were all created for a purpose and a reason. And we spend, if we're blessed, a long time. If we're not blessed, a shorter amount of time trying to figure out why was I created, what was the purpose of my life. And then you hope at the end, we don't fully understand it. It's one of the great mysteries of our faith. But in the end, you hope that when you come face to face with your Creator, He'll say, well done. You walked the path that I had created you for imperfectly, because He knows we're imperfect.
I think that God has raised you up for this moment to do exactly what you're doing. And I would like to pray for you if I could. Please. Right now. Father, I want to thank you for Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and I thank you for raising him up for such a time as this. Continue to give him wisdom and direction to do the right thing, say the right thing at the right time. Protect him, Lord. Watch over him. Watch over his family. Keep his health strong, and may he stay very close to you. And we're so thankful for the way you're using him and will continue to use him in the days ahead. Bless this administration, bless President Trump, and bless the United States of America. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thanks for having
me.
me.
My pleasure. I've had the opportunity to interview some pretty amazing people over the years, from rock stars to movie stars to pastors to politicians. And these are people that influence others. And in my interview that I just did with Secretary of State Marco Rubio, we talked about presidents. He works directly under President Trump. We talked about other presidents that impacted our nation in profound ways, from George Washington to Theodore Roosevelt to Ronald Reagan to Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was the 16th president of the United States of America. Behind me is the Lincoln Memorial, dedicated to his memory. Why was Lincoln a great president? Well, he had the most humble origins imaginable, literally born in a log cabin. He received little to no education, but he was a voracious student and loved to read and learn. And of course, he unified the United States. America was falling apart, and so he unified our nation. Then he freed the slaves. And most significantly, President Lincoln paid the ultimate price. He was assassinated in the Ford Theater at the conclusion of the Civil War. But his words still impact us today. And one of the things that motivated President Abraham Lincoln was his faith in God, his belief in the Bible, his trust in Christ. As we have seen in our interview with Secretary of State Marco Rubio, as we also saw in my interview with Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, and so many others in Washington today who are speaking openly about their faith. I love how Secretary of State Marco Rubio said that, yes, there is a price to pay for being a Christian, but it's a price well worth paying to stand up for Christ. And I'm thankful for men of God in elected office. The Bible says, when the righteous rule, the people rejoice. And we should all remember this when it comes time to vote. Find candidates that are godly. Find candidates that hold to biblical values and have a biblical worldview, and everything will be better in our nation. Oh, it won't be perfect. It never is. But it can be a lot better than when people are godless and are going contrary to what the Word of God says, as many are today doing on the far left. So I thank God that the Lord has placed Marco Rubio in this place of influence as their Secretary of State. And it was a real honor to talk to him today.